Welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for doctors in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risk looks at key medico-legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage those risks. This current series focuses on privacy. Today's podcast is on cyber attacks, how to minimise your risk and what to do if the unthinkable happens. As you will probably all be aware, there have been a number of high-profile cases in 2022 where very large amounts of health information was accessed unlawfully. You'll perhaps recall the ones in a large hospital, and also there was a large PHO that was also in the media last year. And this doesn't just happen in healthcare, of course. Government departments are not immune. We all take patient privacy very seriously, and it is certainly very stressful when there's even a small privacy breach. So what do we do when our entire system has been breached? What can you do to protect your practice from this? Today I'm joined by Mr Joe Fitzgerald from Watt & Carney, our panel law firm. Joe specialises in privacy and in particular managing cyber attacks. So we're really grateful that you've been able to join us today, Joe.
Pleasure to be here.
Looking forward to what you have to share with our listeners. Along with Joe, I also have two of my colleagues. We have Dr. Lucy Gibbard, who's from Taranaki, and Dr. Tim Cookson, who's from Wellington. Both Lucy and Tim are GPs, as am I, and they've both been practice owners for a very long time. So I'm looking forward to your thoughts in this particular topic. So welcome, Lucy and Tim.
Thanks, Sam.
Morning, Lucy. And Sam.
So in October last year, news broke of a cyber attack which affected a large PHO. And I think it was shocking for GPs, as this was the first major cyber attack to impact on primary care, at least that we're aware of. The statistics on cybersecurity incidents in New Zealand are concerning. The 2022 report from CERT NZ shows a rise from less than 2,000 reported incidents in 2017 to around 8,000 in 2022. 22% of incidents included some form of financial loss, with a combined total loss of $20 million last year. So Joe, I just thought I'd ask you first, if we have a look at the smaller scale issues that might affect the private clinicians, in what ways are private medical centres targeted by these cyber criminals, and how do they in fact gain initial access?
Thanks for that, Sam. In terms of the ways private medical centres are targeted, unfortunately, it's in much the same way that many other organisations are targeted as well. I know when I speak to victims of these attacks, often down the smaller end of the spectrum, they say, but why would they be interested in us? And the simple answer to that question is the same reason that attackers are interested in anyone else. They see you as a viable mechanism, a viable way to make money. Unfortunately, the individuals who are perpetrating these attacks are organised crime. We know at any given time there's sort of between 18 and 23 large cyber gangs who are perpetrating the vast majority of attacks that we see, both on larger organisations but smaller organisations as well. And their primary target is making money. They know that if they are able to target an entity that relies on its IT infrastructure to do its job, or alternatively holds information that they do not want being made public, like a private medical centre will have for their patients, they are able to either disable your ability to work or remove that information and extort you for it. That is what they are trying to do. So when we talk about the ways in which private medical centres are targeted, it's to effectively make your life difficult or remove some information that you will then pay to either receive the information back or receive the access back. It's always important to keep in mind when you are targeted by something like this that is sort of the end game of the attackers, regardless of how big you are. And we do see that play out in terms of the size of the ransoms which are increasingly demanded. It used to be a few years ago that the size of the ransom didn't really seem to correlate to the nature of the entity, whereas now we very much see figures being demanded which are which are sort of consummate to the size of the victim. Perhaps we can talk a little bit later on about ransoms and that sort of thing. But in terms of how they're gaining access, there's really two main categories of vectors. The first is through technical issues. There was a number of attacks in 2021 which were to do with systems not being updated properly. When systems are updated, holes are plugged. If those holes aren't plugged because the systems aren't updated, attackers can leverage them. Alternatively, relatively straightforward security mechanisms not being placed, things like MFA on remote access ports. When we all started working from home more regularly, IT networks all around the country had a whole bunch of holes punched in them so that we could work remotely. And often those holes weren't secured properly with things like multi-factor authentication. So technical measures are a big part of how initial access is gained. Probably not as large as the second way in which access is gained, which is human error. Time and time again, and this is a very human rational thing, people received emails purporting to be from someone else, contain a link. You click on the link, the attackers are then able to make their way through. I would say, before I took up my job at Wadden & Carney in New Zealand, I worked at a big law firm in London where we had a big cyber team, and our head of, one of our heads of cyber, we had a number of them, would regularly sort of conduct these phishing exercises on the cyber team itself, the attorneys who were doing this work day in, day out, and we would get caught by these things. So I think it's worth noting that while leveraging of sort of human errors, people clicking on things they shouldn't be clicking on, interacting on things they shouldn't be interacting with, is a large part of it. It's also something which is just very natural and normal for people to do, unfortunately.
That clicking on a link is obviously a really common one. I was aware of a case involving a general practice where exactly that happened. The practice received an email from a patient, so it was the patient's email address, and the content of the email looked consistent with what might be coming from that patient, and there was a link in it which the person at the practice clicked on, and almost immediately everything started to go blank in the practice. Now, they were fortunate in that didn't give access to the practice management system. So there was a two-layer system, but it did stop everyone working at that practice for that day, and it took the IT people a full day to restore activity. There was a demand for a ransom which wasn't paid. It wasn't a very big one. This was probably 8 or 9 years ago now that this one occurred. And fortunately, all the backup systems worked. So when the problem had been resolved by the IT people, the practice could get up and running again. But it certainly was a reminder to that practice of the importance of not clicking on links.
I think part of the issue is that if your backups are not entirely up to date, and honestly, I'm a bit of a technophobe, so I don't even know how that even operates with backup systems these days. But if you've got a gap of a few days and you've obviously seen a lot of patients, you end up with, I don't remember what I prescribed. I don't remember what that consultation was about. I've got no clinical notes to work from. So it does become a risk, doesn't it, for us from a medico-legal perspective?
Yeah, well, certainly for that day, that practice, they were operating completely without background information. So any patient that came in, the doctors would be saying, now, can you remind me what medication you're on, please, so that I can repeat that? And is there anything that I should know about your past history that I can't remember that might be relevant? So, yeah, it was a real impediment.
I was interested when you said MFA, and you did go on later to say what that was, multi-factor authentication. You have to remember that a lot of clinicians don't speak techno language.
Yes.
So we could just perhaps bear people like me in mind.
Of course.
It's the use of TLAs, isn't it?
TLAs, yes. 3-letter acronym.
Yes.
So, Joe, what would you suggest private clinics do to minimise their risk of a successful attack?
Absolutely. Really good question, and one we get asked quite a lot. Again, there's sort of a couple of elements to this, but the first is probably around that human element we talked about earlier today. If you're going to minimise that risk. You can never extinguish it, but if you're going to minimise that risk as much as you can, a bit of online training does absolute wonders. What you want to do is arm people with knowledge around the kinds of things that should set off a little light bulb in their head, really. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner on their website has some really fantastic resources. CERT-NZ, the Computer Emergency Response Team, has some fantastic resources on their website as well. So in terms of your first line of defence as a practice, particularly if you're a smaller practice, arming your people with information is the number one thing. The second thing is the technical side of it. And I realise this can be a bit intimidating. I'm not technically trained. I'm a lawyer. I certainly need help with all kinds of IT problems every single day. But what I would say is that the vast majority of technical attack vectors we see used are not very complicated. It's the really basic stuff that's being exploited. And again, what that loops back to is the attacker's motivation. They're looking to make money. They're going to go for the low-hanging fruit. So just make sure that your practice isn't the low-hanging fruit. I think earlier I might have mentioned MFA, multi-factor authentication, which is, for those of you who have experienced it, is the sort of annoying thing you have to do when you log onto an email account and then you get something sent to your phone and you have to click the button. What we're effectively talking about here is something other than a password to get into an account. But it's not necessary for you to wrap your head around MFA per se. What I would say is if you have an IT provider or you have someone who's running your IT network, have a talk to them about the last time security was considered for your network. If you're doing it yourself, there's some really fantastic resources available on the CERT-NZ website. And in particular, I believe they have a list of 11 controls, 11 basic controls that everyone can implement that will effectively take you off that ground floor of IT security, will elevate you ever so slightly. So having MFA in place, ensuring that you have backups of some kind. You don't necessarily have to manage them yourself, but having backups is absolutely critical for if something does go wrong. There's some settings that it can guide you through changing on your email accounts to ensure that logging is turned on. What that effectively means is that if someone gets into an email account, you can see what they did. So a lot of this is about keeping people out, but it's also assuming, if something does happen, and things do happen, that you're in a position to respond. So, as I say, CERT-NZ has some fantastic resources, also worth looking on the Office of the Privacy Commissioner's website for some training.
I was going to ask, how do they know who the low-hanging fruit are? Do they send an email to every medical centre in New Zealand? How does that work?
That's an excellent question. Those are how those phishing campaigns work, right? They will compromise an account. If there's nothing interesting in that account, they will then use it to spray hundreds of phishing emails out to those people's recipients. Then if people click on it and enter credentials, the attacker knows that there's, maybe an in there. They are operating on sort of a spray and pray approach, right? They're looking to gain access to as many systems as possible. And then if you have MFA on board, they're going to try log into the account using the access, but they're not going to be able to. So it really is, in terms of how it works, a case of quantity for them rather than quality. They're going to go for the people who are willing to click on the links. Even if they click on the links, they're only going to go for the people who then don't have other security in place. So it's really, as I say, about making sure that you're not the easiest target out of the 300 they might have gone for.
A few years ago in Queensland, a whole lot of practices were targeted, and a number of them fell foul. And it was a Romanian group, and it was the one group that attacked all of the practices in Queensland, and a whole lot didn't have sufficient security and got in trouble.
I was just wondering, are you either of Lucy or Tim aware of the PMSs? Do they have multi-factor? What do you call it? Multi-factor?
Multi-factor authentication?
MFA.
We're on Indice, and when you log in the practice, you don't have to. But if you log in from home, it goes to your phone, and you have to enter a number that's come up on your phone. So that's how that works. I don't know for medtech now.
No, nor do I.
But I'm assuming then that they can add that. Is that right, Joe? They can add some other layer? Absolutely.
So any cloud service these days, any modern cloud service, including your practice management software, will have an option to make sure that's turned on. Yeah.
So let's say that these criminals have accessed the system. Clinicians can feel incredibly overwhelmed because most of us don't know much about IT. What should the clinicians do at that point if they know someone's accessed the system?
So the first thing would be not to panic. If I know it's the sort of the worst advice in the world, but these attacks are happening all across the country, all across the world, all the time. You are in very good company. The second thing would be to consider informing your insurance company if you have cyber insurance. The honest truth is that cyber insurance is a bit more of an active insurance product than other insurance products. It's not a case of being an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. Most cyber insurance products provide you with an instant responder, someone who can step in and assist you with what to do next, make sure you have the right resources, guide you through the process, someone who does this for a living. So if you do have cyber insurance and this has happened and you're wondering what to do, that's a really good starting point to get your response kicked off. The third thing to consider is the OPC, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, has set out a really good straightforward framework for dealing not just with malicious cyber attacks but accidental privacy incidences as well, and I've always thought it's a good framework to work through. It used to be called the CRANE framework. They've now changed it to the CAMP framework, but CRANE is the one that's etched into my brain. So CRANE, like the big metal thing you use to move boxes around, so you contain something, you identify what the problem is, and you ensure it's not going to get any worse. This is really important in cyber incidences because what we don't want to do is rush around and restore everything, but not have actually kicked the attackers out. So that's a case of talking to your IT provider. They often will get a specialist involved to assist in containing the incident, make sure the what we call the threat vector has been identified. You then remediate it, and these things might cross over, but remediation is about bringing your systems back online, ensuring that you can continue going about your day job. As I say, that might overlap with the containment stage. You do want to be a little bit careful because if you start restoring from backups, but for example, an attacker hasn't been removed from your system, you might find yourself for a relapse. So it's important to make sure that you're doing those things in sort of a sensible order. The third thing you want to do is assess the scope of the incident. So once you've contained it, once you're back up online, you're able to do the things you need to do to business as usual, provide your services. You want to help. You want to determine how far this has gone. What did the attackers do? What might have they accessed? What might have they taken? That is the third step in all of this. You only need to do that once you have actually got yourselves back up and running again. I know lots of practices and lots of entities across New Zealand feel a real pressure to identify the impact straight away. But you've got to work through that process. And to that point, the fourth step is notification. So if you have contained everything, you're back up and running, you've assessed the scope of it, you know what's happened, and you identify that some information has been impacted, perhaps it's been interfered with or otherwise taken, you then think about whether you need to tell anyone. And there's obligations under the Privacy Act around informing people if there's a risk of serious harm. But again, I'd emphasise that's the fourth step in the process. You certainly shouldn't feel like you need to rush out and have all the answers for everyone straight away. One of the mistakes we do see made is practices going out on day one and telling people we're very confident that your information hasn't been taken. And you simply might not be able to answer that question. Absolutely, you might have to communicate with your stakeholders to explain, we've had an IT incident. We are, experiencing restricted access to our files. We're working on ways to ensure we can keep providing our services and bear with us. But I certainly wouldn't recommend people extend that to and we can promise that nothing's been impacted until you've had a chance to investigate. The final stage in sort of the CRANE response framework is evaluation, and this is something you can do after the event. It's effectively running the ruler over what you did, seeing how well it worked and seeing what you could do better next time. This might sound a little bit less important than the other steps there, but what I would note is this is something the regulators really, really value. They don't, in my experience, tend to be critical of people for getting compromised. They don't tend to be critical of parties for not doing things exactly the way they would have done them. Where they do get critical is if people have the same thing happen over and over again, where if you'd taken the lessons from the first time, you wouldn't be in that position. So I think it's just worth noting, if you are a practice, and there's plenty out there who have had multiple cyber incidences, do just make sure that you've taken the lessons from those and that you've implemented them to ensure that something like that doesn't happen again if you can avoid it.
And talking about perhaps what the Privacy Commissioner's Office, how they respond to these sorts of cyber attacks, if a patient makes a complaint about a breach or they've been involved in, their information's up on the dark web, and they make a complaint about the practice, are you aware of any cases and what those outcomes would be for the practice?
Yeah, it's a really good question. A short story, we're not aware of any complaints made in those circumstances. It is something we're all waiting for, to be honest with you. I'm sort of staggered we haven't had one to date. The obligations on a practice vis-a-vis keeping information secure aren't to be Fort Knox. IPP 5, Information Principle 5 under the Privacy Act, and also Rule 5 under the Health Information Privacy Code requires that you have proportionate and adequate security measures in place. So that's saying that if you're holding highly sensitive information, you probably should have turned your mind to the security of it. It doesn't require, as I say, that you are Fort Knox. If you are a 5-person practice somewhere up and down the country, there's an acknowledgement that you're only going to have certain resources in place to defend yourself. That obligation isn't to keep things safe all the time, every single hour of the day. So what the individual would have to show is not that you were compromised, but actually you were compromised because you didn't have appropriate security in place. That's going to be a pretty tricky burden to establish. The other thing that people could arguably complain about is if there was an obligation to notify and you didn't. That is something that the Privacy Act explicitly provides damages for. So when you get to that second, third, fourth stage of the Crane framework, if you're a little bit unsure about the privacy obligations, should you be telling people, reach out to your advisors, take some advice. But no, short answer, we don't have any cases yet. But I think when those do come around, there's going to be some hoops for those complainants to jump through.
Can I just ask about the notification thing? Because I know that's further down in your list of we don't need to do that right away. But you're talking in that about notifying the people who may be affected. I'm just wondering about that other thing, which is notifying the Privacy Commissioner, because you also have obligations there, don't you? And I would have thought if you're saying, well, I'm going to wait till I'm back up and I'm waiting for assessment, that actually it might be a little bit down the track that you're going to be notifying the people involved, but do you have an obligation to notify the Privacy Commissioner faster than that? Yeah,
it's a really, really great point, Lucy, and it's something I definitely should have clarified. You strictly speaking don't. But what the Privacy Commissioner has said is, in the case of ransomware incidents in particular, we know that the attackers are malicious and we know that the attackers, some of them, have a habit of taking things. So we would like to be informed as you're investigating. Rather than waiting until you're ready to tell absolutely everyone else. They, in particular, have adopted this 72-hour timeframe. That's not in the legislation. It's something they've taken from the European Data Protection Framework, which has a different notification threshold. So the 72 hours makes more sense in that context. What I would say, if you do suffer an attack, you're absolutely right. Putting in a notification to the OPC saying this has happened, we still don't fully understand the impacts of it, we'll let you know, is a sensible thing to do. You can do it online. They have a breach notification form you can fill in. I would recommend speaking to your advisors before you do anything like that. Certainly, if you have cyber insurers, the entities that you usually take advice from on privacy information governance issues, just to make sure you're not saying anything that you might not want to walk back later. But look, our experience with the OPC is if you engage with them early, what you will get back is a response saying, "Thank you very much. We appreciate you telling us. Let us know how things go." They might swing in and get involved if they're a little bit worried that you don't have the resources you need to deal with things. But our experience is, generally speaking, they'll let you get on with it. But no, absolutely, you're quite right to point out that notifying the regulator is something you might want to do a bit earlier.
And there's no risk to notifying them earlier. As you're saying, there may be some things you don't particularly want to open up with if it's not something you're going to need to, but actually seeking that advice beforehand, there's actually very little risk to an early notification to the Privacy Commission.
In our experience, yes. Look, they do have these tools available to them, things like compliance notices, which they can use to kind of compel entities to do certain things, but they've been using those in very rare circumstances and following very long investigations. So realistically, if your notification is, hey, here's what's happened and here's what we're doing about it here and now today, next to no risk associated with that, I would say.
That's a great point. The other thing I was thinking about was, we're thinking about notifying the people affected, the patients and the Privacy Commissioner. But the other thing is it's a crime, and surely we should be calling the police, shouldn't we? And surely that should be quite early on in the period that we'd actually say, are we calling the police? Or I assume some of the cyber attackers are saying if you call the police, it's going to get worse. I don't really know.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, another really good point. The police does have a high-tech crime unit. So they have a specific unit which deals with these sorts of crimes, and they do want to know about them. So there's the 105 notification line for notifying sort of non-urgent crimes, and that's where we tend to get the most joy in terms of notifying those through. The other thing is CERT NZ again, to bring them up. You can notify via a form online. There's no need to. It's not a legal requirement to tell CERT, but what we do find is that actually it's a helpful thing to do. They have pointers around how you can deal with things, but also they have a direct connection into the police as well. So they will often pass that information on for you. As you say, this is criminal conduct. It's the kind of thing that the police do like to know about. You shouldn't necessarily slow down your response while you're waiting for feedback from those entities, but a really good thing to do. Yeah.
So CERT NZ, that's the Computer Emergency Response Team.
That's
right?
the one. Yeah.
So who actually runs that? What?
Great question. So CERT is the public-facing element of New Zealand's government sort of cybersecurity intelligence response. So it's the public-facing element of effectively the National Cybersecurity Centre, which deals with incidents which impact New Zealand sort of at a national level. The bigger things you're seeing in the news, the NCSC is going to be directly involved. CERT NZ's main function, really, from what we see, is educational. They're there to ensure that people are getting the information they need to increase their cybersecurity posture, all these really good things. And for that reason, again, I might have been the third or fourth time, but their website is really, really good. It has lots of good resources on it, but they do have this reporting function. Sam mentioned at the start the statistics. That is where those statistics are drawn from these notifications. But at the same time, if you do notify them, they do have sort of a response capacity. They are there to provide pointers. They're not necessarily going to get involved hands on keyboards actually doing things, but they might be able to provide you with some direction on how to deal with things. But they are part of the New Zealand government's sort of wider cybersecurity and incident response capacity.
Can I just ask Sam, what's medical protection's role here? Why are we talking about this?
That's a really good point, Lucy. Well, we obviously deal with a lot of issues around privacy breaches. Cyber attacks are a little different. They're relatively new to MPS, I think. But we will help practices talk through which patients need to be notified about the breach, because there are some instances where you don't notify a patient because it's not in the patient's best interests. And that can be very difficult for clinicians to determine, should I tell the patient or not? And so MPS will talk through that kind of scenario for each of those patients with you. In terms of when there was the privacy breach related to the PHO, we did provide some practices with advice. In fact, I asked Joe to get involved because of his specialisation in this area. And so there are certainly things that MPS can help with.
But what about insurance? Does MPS offer insurance against cyber attacks?
No, we don't. And so I'm assuming it's the commercial insurers who will provide the cyber insurance, Joe. Would that be right?
It certainly is. Look, it's a really common product these days in the sense that lots of insurers offer it. Lots of insurers offer it at different levels. There are the kind of the Rolls-Royce products down to the more kind of practical, more narrow products. But if you have an insurance broker, do go speak to them, and they will be able to make recommendations to you around what's appropriate for your practice, given your information framework and the size of your patient base.
So we will provide advice, and we certainly always help with the lower level privacy breaches and privacy questions that practices have, particularly for those practices now that have the practice package. Let's just say that a privacy breach has happened through the receptionist, for example, or the practice manager. We will certainly help practices who have the practice package with us, but otherwise we will be helping every individual member with their specific questions around individual privacy breaches. So in December 22, news broke of a cyber attack affecting thousands of coronial and health files, and it was stated in a news article that the criminals gained access through an external IT provider. So in these types of cases, the files get encrypted, restricting normal access by the business, and files are exfiltrated, as they say, or stolen, and sometimes released on the dark web. So, Joe, do you have any advice for private clinicians who use an external IT provider? Because I'm assuming most of us do. Are there ways to minimise the risk when using these providers?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question, and it's one that's coming up more and more. I think I mentioned at the start that attackers are financially motivated. What external IT providers present is a really fantastic opportunity to hit multiple entities through one attack. Look, it's always going to be tricky to minimise risks in any way, shape, or form. But I think with your IT providers, certainly ensuring you have a good understanding of what they're doing for you and what they're not doing for you. Often, IT providers are absolutely intrinsic to the way our practices, our businesses are working. We've had long-term relationships with them. We rely on them. The original contract you signed might be however old, and over time, it might be that there's a lack of clarity. We see this quite often around what falls within their remit and what doesn't fall within their remit. And in particular, does security fall within their remit? Do backups fall within their remit? Are they managing your emails for you? If you're looking for kind of a starting point for a discussion with your IT provider, one good thing to always check is what falls within their duty of care. What is it they are doing for you? The other thing is, if you hadn't spoken about security for some time, it's probably a discussion worth having. More and more IT providers are willing to do a little bit of an audit or a review of your security posture and say, well, here's what we implemented however many years ago. Why don't we do an uplift? Why don't we bring that back up to speed? While you're doing that, another really helpful thing to do is to get a sense of what are they holding for you and what are you holding yourself. Often we conceive of our sort of IT networks as ours and mine. Those are my computers, those are my documents, they're sitting on my system. Whereas in reality, often your information, your data is either sitting with your IT provider or alternatively sitting in the cloud. That means that they're paying for a service provided by Amazon or Microsoft or someone similar, and the information is being held in a server farm somewhere far, far away. So giving some thought to, what is it that your IT provider holds on behalf of you? Is it appropriate that they are holding that information? In some cases, there's a good argument to be made that it's not only appropriate but proper, because their security will be better than yours. But giving some thought to, what is it that they are holding for you? So look, I mean, it's always tricky with our external IT providers because often we've had relationships with them for a really long time. But first of all, have a think about what is it they are doing for you? What's actually the scope of the services they're providing? If it's been some time since you've actually considered the security posture with them, maybe talk to them about doing a review, doing an uplift. They're the experts, they're the ones who are there to talk to you about these things. And 3, where actually is your information? Are you holding it? Are they holding it? Is a third party holding it? And just gives them some thought to, is it appropriate, given the nature of that information, that that's where it lives, or should it be somewhere else?
Thanks for that, Joe. Well, how about we wrap up this podcast? In terms of what I've heard from you today, Joe, in terms of the things that people might take away from this podcast, is to know that it's really common for cyber attacks to happen, and that there are simple things that practices can do, like getting multifactorial
authentication.
You think I would learn that by now? I have to use the word MFA. I'm showing my age, aren't I? Getting MFA training of staff is probably important, which is not something necessarily that general practices would be thinking about terribly much. But anyway, that's certainly worth thinking about. And I really like your acronym CRANE about what to do when a breach does happen. And I understand that there's lots of information on the Privacy Commissioner's website. And thanks for your help in terms of thinking about what we do with an IT provider. And hopefully it doesn't happen to any of our listeners. But if it does happen, it sounds like there's some things that they can certainly do. And of course, for medical protection members, please do give us a call. Joe, who's sitting with us today, is just a phone call away and can certainly give initial advice. Thanks, Lucy and Tim, for your input as well. So thank you to our listeners for joining us today. We hope it's been helpful. We look forward to catching up with you in our next podcast in this privacy series. If you like the Medical Protection Podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. And if you'd like a different podcast on a specific topic, please do feel free to email us on nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org. We'll catch you next time.